Hello and welcome to the July 16th, 2024 Planning Commission meeting. We'll get, does Demi usually use the gavel? Do we just start? I think we just start. All right, I'll call us to order. Can we get the roll call, please?
Chair Adkins,
Present.
Commissioner Yanasak,
Here.
Commissioner Finch,
Here.
Commissioner Ballard,
Here.
Commissioner Sullivan,
Here.
Commissioner Shelby,
Here.
Commissioner Lark.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, I will now read the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the original inhabitants of this place, the Stahopes people, and their successors, the Tulalip tribes. Since time immemorial, they have hunted, fished, gathered on, and taken care of these lands and waters. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. We will strive to be honest about our past mistakes and bring about a future that includes their people, stories, and voices to form a more just and equitable society. All right, now on to approval of the minutes. On the cheat sheet I have, it says the minutes are from March 19th, 2024. I presume that's an error? Yes. When was our last meeting? May 18th. Oh, June 18th. Okay. So I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes for the June 18th Planning Commission meeting.
I make a motion so as amended.
Second.
All right, I hear a motion and a second. Are there any opposed? Okay, any discussion, I should say? All right, I think we're on to a roll call vote of that.
Chair Adkins,
Yes.
Commissioner Yanasak,
Abstain.
Commissioner Finch,
Abstain?
Commissioner Ballard,
Yes.
Commissioner Sullivan,
Yes.
Commissioner Shelby,
Yes.
Commissioner Lark.
Abstain.
Thank you.
All right, now on to reports and comments. Do we have any reports among our commissioners?
No report, but I would like to take advantage of the comment section. About just a little over a month ago, I came back from about a month on active duty orders down at the National Training Center, where I was working with a striker brigade, about 6,000 active duty members, and a lot has transpired in the world. And I think about the U.S.'s role in the world, the responsibility our nation has for ensuring global order, and I think about how that responsibility trickles down to local level governments as well. And so when I think about everything here on the agenda tonight, I think of how important it is to think about it in the broader global context of what we are doing to ensure democratic norms, broader multinational lateral institutions, and what we're doing to resource not only just our citizens for success, but all of but our nation for success. And so I just want to lean into how important that is as we think about housing, especially that we're thinking about that housing in the context of what we're doing to ensure our global competitive nature in the coming century, and that we are able to, be the authors of our own destiny and have the resources to be the authors of our own destiny as we've been for almost a century now. So I just wanted to leave that comment and have that as a capstone as we think about a lot of these issues. Thank you for your time.
Any further reports or comments from commissioners?
I think you should use the gavel if you want to.
I do too. Freely, use it freely.
All right, hearing no other comments or reports, we'll move on to staff comment.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, commissioners. Hope you're enjoying a wonderful summer. Thank you for sharing one of those glorious evenings with us here in pursuit of a positive world order that starts at our front door here. A couple of updates on items that have come through the Planning Commission and gone through the council. I will start with something that is not on your agenda that has previously been the birthing centers. I forgot to get the hearing notice out. The next meeting would be a public hearing. It's 19 days ahead of time I have to do that. I did not have that right on my calendar. So we'll pick that back up at the next meeting. There's nothing gone awry other than my own to-do list. Transportation Improvement Program, recommended by this body, or at least by consensus of those present. That one did pass the council at last week's meeting. The Park District also finally made its way through the council. So you may have seen in the papers, last week's meeting, the council approved the development agreement, plan development overlay, comprehensive plan amendment, and street vacation. I wanted to cover quickly the changes that the council made since the Planning Commission made its recommendation in February, I think it was, which was a recommendation to approve the plan development overlay and the comprehensive plan amendment. The development agreement was not yet written, and the street vacation was council authority. So you looked at just a piece of the whole package. Of that piece, the council, actually it was before the council got it in discussions with the Delta neighborhood and some community leaders, the mayor asked the staff to drop the maximum height limit from 15 to 12. That was one of the requests that the community had, and that was made before it went to the council, and that was supported by the council. I think of everything that the Planning Commission looked at, that was the one change. The maximum height had been 15. Most of the buildings remain unchanged, but the ones that were potentially going to 15 would drop down to 12. The total unit count of 1,500 units is anticipated to remain the same. EHA's position was that the 15 floors provided some flexibility in floor layouts, the opportunity for perhaps larger units, perhaps more open space on the ground, but it didn't necessarily translate to dropping it from 15 to 12 would mean that the park would shrink or something like that. So we're working now on the next phase, which is a final development plan, some minor refinements to the preliminary development plan, and then construction permits for the first phase. So excited to see that moving. The other pieces that helped get this over the finish line with the council included a public services mitigation payment. So if you remember, EHA as an agency is exempt from property taxes, and a development of this size would create some demands for public services, most notably police and fire. So part of the negotiations included working into the development agreement a SEPA, State Environmental Policy Act based mitigation payment of about $230 per unit. And that is in today's dollars that would go up commensurate with the inflation for police and fire salaries. That would add up to about 2/3, I think it was, roughly in the early years of what the property tax would have been to the city. And that starts 15 years after certificate of occupancy for a given building. So there's an MFTE analogous kind of a grace period, which was essential to EHA to get the financial footing to be able to cover the costs of the debt service early in the project. Obviously, they weren't thrilled about it even after 15 years, but that was an important part of the negotiation. There were a couple other letters of intent and recitals and provisions in the development agreement that were added that covered pedestrian connections. You heard a lot of concerns about crosswalks and sidewalks in the area. There was a provision that allowed EHA to build a set of sidewalk and crosswalk improvements and credit that against the transportation impact fee, which is not normal practice and not something that Public Works was thrilled about, but again, it was a way to arrive at a negotiation and a consensus there. Non-residential space activation. The community wanted non-residential space, a place to gather, a coffee shop, some opportunity to go shopping, but then was also concerned that that space would be left vacant and would create kind of a negative street level atmosphere. So there were some provisions around if the non-residential space was vacant for 6 months, then EHA must maintain it in good condition and wrap the front. If it was vacant for another 6 months, EHA must offer some kind of tenant improvement or rent concessions, and then there was something else after that period. So that package was added, and then there was also some language around the wetlands directly west of the site, and which is currently owned by the Boys and Girls Club, and now there's a plan in place to look at transferring that to the city and potentially activating it with a boardwalk or some sort of nature interpretive trail. And then the EHA-owned portion of Wiggum's Hollow Park, there was a letter of intent not to develop that for any purpose in the foreseeable future. and that EHA would work with the community and with the city on a positive future for that piece of land. So those were all of the kind of negotiated pieces that were able to bring this to the finish line, and then ultimately it was approved by the council on a 6-0 vote. And it will be exciting to watch that project progress over time. I think that's it. Happy to take any questions on this or anything else.
Do we have any questions?
Just a quick one. So with that approval from the council, what's the next step? Is there like an ETA and kind of when they're gonna, when EHA thinks they could kind of really start breaking ground on that?
Yeah, they've got architects, they put that process was moving quickly back when it was at the planning commission. They put all the consultants on ice for a little bit because of some uncertainty around its ultimate success. They're thawed out now, not hard to do on a warm day like today, and they're working fast. So we've got regular meetings, and they're with the permit services crew and public works, and they're doing final design on the phase 1, which is the part with the park, and I think it's the northeast corner of the development. So maybe within the next year could start see demolition and site prep, and I don't know that I would hazard much more of a guess than that, but they're on a quite fast track. So we'll take that into account as we advance the comprehensive plan update. You'll see that in the next iteration of kind of the alternative maps, the brown maps, I call them, with the high, medium, and low. You'll see the actual result of the Park District PDO now incorporated into there and as part of the context for our update.
Any further comments or questions?
Just a question on the, in the past, we've talked about potentially you coming forward to us with key metrics about development starts. I think
Yeah.
this is the third or fourth time I've brought this up.
Yeah.
Any progress towards that?
Some, and we're still working towards 5280, I think it was the Senate bill that required some new permit processing metrics and accountability standards, certain number of days from permit application to issuance with kind of a shot clock thing. This 2024 year is a dry run year. We're supposed to collect the data, and then next year it becomes actionable in terms of if we don't meet those timelines. So that created a whole new permit. This is what I said last time, that was coming. Now we're halfway through it, developing a new kind of permit tracking system. But in general, no, we have not gotten to that request. But still, I think I talked to the team about it a couple times this week, actually.
Any further comments or questions? All right, moving on to opening public comment. Ayana, do we have any in-person or virtual participants?
No comments.
All right, then I hope everyone's fine with me skipping the instructions to participants. Do we have to close the public comment? Okay. Then we'll move on to old business, the Everett 2044 Climate Change and Resiliency Element. So Yorick?
Just before we get to that, or I guess in opening for that, we've got some overall, just a reminder of where we are in the sequence. We handed out, I think at the last meeting, a schedule and an outline of the elements. We've got some new titles, and that document had the vision statements and the scope of each of the elements, and then we had a proposed calendar for walking through each of them. For the most part, 2 meetings per element with some overlaps. We are now into the 3rd meeting of this series. 2nd, actually, middle housing wasn't part of that. You heard about climate change and resiliency element and proposed goals, policies, and actions at the last meeting, and we're back for a 2nd round on that, looking for kind of an early head nod. And these will not be closed by any stretch, just because they're off the calendar here, and you'll see at the very end of this schedule of bringing it all together. We would expect to bring housing back next week after we get your comments and comments from the public and incorporate those. The only other thing I'll highlight on this calendar, which we'll put up on the screen each time we come back to track our progress through all of this, is that November, which is normally 5, there was a request at the last meeting not to have a planning commission meeting on election night. We are, it would be helpful to have 2 meetings in November, although we understand the competing attention on that particular evening. Wanted to see if there were any ideas for when we might be able to reschedule it that week. I think one thought that came up was to have it be a Wednesday or a Thursday in that week, or a different Tuesday or something. So just wanted to put that out there as an option, and maybe we can follow up on email, or we can work with the chair on that. But initially, initial read on potentially not having it that Tuesday, but still having it in early November sometime. Seems okay. Okay. We got a lot of work to do, and I think we're in a groove now, so I want to keep that going.
The August meeting is on the 20th, not the 16th,
Thank you.
unless you want to come in on a Friday.
Thank you.
I can't think of a better use of Friday night, right?
Thank you. Okay, and then Allison, are you gonna share the outline? You want me to hand it out and you can speak to it?
Essentially do all of them.
Good evening. While you're getting ready to do bits and pieces, I just wanted to give you some information on the whole. So the first is the table that you got at the last meeting, which is the vision and elements document, just as a reminder that this is all of what's going into the document. The second item that you're getting is just a brief set of definitions on goals, policies, and action items, so that as we're continuing to go through them, what they are, how they all fit together, and where we're going. The third item you're getting is a draft outline of the document. And draft in every sense of the word draft. So if there's something missing, please feel free to let us know. But it's, again, to give you an idea of how all of this fits together as you're looking at the specific elements that are being discussed. So none of this is earth-shattering or really new information, but it's just to give you an idea of what it is as you start seeing the bits and pieces, how we are looking at the whole. And with that, I will give it over to climate change.
And I got one more prefatory piece, so this applies to all of the elements. We probably should have started with this last week.
They got it. That's one of their pieces
Oh,
of
good,
paper.
yeah, got that there. So in short, we've got goals, policies, and actions. We used to have objectives. Staff saw goals and objectives as being pretty much synonyms, so we at least simplified it in that way. As we've been writing these goals, policies, and actions, we're trying to stay close to these definitions. A goal is what we're trying to achieve. So if we are successful as a city around 2044, what is it that we have achieved? The policy is how we get there. Then actions are clear and discrete work program items that you know when you've started and when you've completed. So if it's a recurring thing or always do it like that, that's a policy. If it's a thing that we're gonna do it once and it's gonna be complete, that's an action. There's not gonna be many of those because it's a lot of work to complete. These are significant actions. And now, that was further ado, but without any more further ado, Karen.
All right, good evening, Karen Stewart, environmental planner. So let's see, you should have in your packet that was mailed to you, staff memorandum from Allison and myself dated July 12th. It's quite short, but it's talking about climate change and resiliency element. And at your June 18th meeting, I was here and did a presentation on that, sort of talking about the background, and did get some good comments, I thought, from the commission. And 2 items, so there's 3 exhibits. Exhibit 1 is new and that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about tonight. It's a draft climate change and resiliency element. Then Exhibit 2 was what one of the handouts you had last time. That's on the landscape orientation of legal size page. And it's what we're calling the goal alignment table. And you'll start seeing this with each of these elements as they come forward. And so that's sort of focusing on the goals, the big picture. And then the second item that was presented last time is called Exhibit 3. And it's the draft climate change resiliency goals and policies related to the multi-county planning policies from Puget Sound Regional Council. And so it was sort of the big list. And then, of course, we have our existing climate change and sustainability element that, as Yorick mentioned, has objectives, but also has goals and policies. So all of that staff has been looking at. And we have, so the steps that we talked about last time, which we have gone through now, one thing is to prepare what is Exhibit 1, which is an actual draft element. And the other thing that we addressed was doing a crosswalk between different comprehensive plan elements that deal with climate change, because it's a broad topic, a lot of interaction, obviously, with transportation element. And so as I'm walking through that, sort of keep in mind that that's the process we're going to be using as we are drafting these elements. A couple of things that are a little bit unique with this element on climate change. There is ongoing updating of our hazard mitigation plan that we prepare, our emergency management office prepares every 5 years, has to be approved by FEMA. That's still ongoing. There's a possibility that we'll need to make some changes to the climate change and resiliency element to have them in alignment. So just wanted to let you know about that. And another unique feature of this element is it's optional at this point, but our city has elevated addressing climate change and sustainability back in 2014, 2015. So it's been an element for a while now, over 10 years. So we're continuing that. We technically have, though, until the year 2029 to prepare this element. And the state is working on a model of what should be contained in the element. There are some state requirements right now that we know about, and I'll address those when I go through the element. But you can expect that we'll be coming back to you sooner than 10 years with this element again. And we are required to have the state actually approve the element, which is unique also. So just a little heads up about that. So now, any questions so far? Okay, so let's look at the Exhibit 1 that is in your packet. And I'll just kind of walk through this and sort of highlight a few things that we addressed based on commissioner comments last time. So starting out with a vision, talking a little bit about the scope of the element, and then you'll see a section with a heading key definitions, and a couple of them that I wanted to mention. There was a question about sustainability. I was talking about the difference between sustainability and resiliency, but didn't have the actual definition of sustainability, so providing that for you there. And then greenhouse gases, and sort of the science behind it. There was comment made that the public might be confused about, first of all, climate change continues to be controversial, then what are greenhouse gases? So we have a definition there from the state. that we are required to use in our element. And then turning the page on page 2, we have a graphic that might be good for people who are visual learners, where they can look at that and maybe understand greenhouse gases a little bit better. So then trying to not get all bogged down in describing the science, but have a few paragraphs there. Then an element that, or excuse me, a heading that you're going to be seeing often, and we're probably, as we're writing the 12 elements of the plan, we don't want to be redundant. So we might be shifting when we're talking about addressing racial and social equity. We might be moving that to a unique chapter. So just a heads up on that. Now, the goals and policies. And this was presented, I know Yorick went through the plethora of ones that we were looking at. And the two major headings for goals and policies for this element are, first of all, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then the second one is creating resilient communities. And so that's in the state legislation. So we're starting to organize the element around those topics. And so you'll see we have, I think we've got 5 goals total. So let's see. There was some discussion at our last meeting. Trying to remember exactly. If there are some questions, I don't know if commissioners, since this was in your packet, if you've had a chance to actually look at the content, which is similar to what you saw last time, but not everything is listed in this section. I'll keep going and we can get into the substance in a moment. The next section is implementing actions for the next 5 years. You saw all of this last time. And then the last few pages, last 2 pages, are the crosswalk. So different topics, and you'll hear about one when Frank is up here talking about the housing element. So there's one that it was suggested be looked at for inclusion in the housing element. So you'll get familiar with these different abbreviations. The TR would be transportation element, UF is urban form, DD, design and development, ED, economic development, and then a new element, EAI.
Equity,
No, engagement, administration, and implementation.
Thank you. And these topics and elements should be on your outline from Alice Ann. Sorry, I don't have that right in front of me. So now, going back to page 3, the goals and policies. I am definitely not going to read these to you, but does anybody have any comments on these draft goals and policies in this section?
I have a
Yes.
question. So it says Everett community greenhouse gas emissions decreased 50% from 2014 to 2030, 80% from 2014 to 2050. Where did those numbers come from? Is there some guidance provided on that, or is that just something we've picked?
Our climate action plan is the source of that information. However, there was a correction that needed to be made. So the base year, our carbon wedge analysis was done by a consultant, and the base year was actually 2014. So that's one correction that we have from the climate action plan, but that's where that's from.
I guess my thought is it just does not seem very ambitious.
Okay? We can
Fr-
come up
frankly,
with
it-
a
to
new
me-
goal. Once we
Well, and
have
I'm not
that
s-
goal,
yeah.
we can keep going.
Right, and I understand we're not an island. I guess that was kind of another question I had here. You mentioned like the regional council and things like that. I mean, I would hope that this is being done in conjunction with our neighboring communities, the state, the nation, the world, because you can't just, right, I mean, City of Everett could be down to 0, but if everyone else around us is pumping it out, it's not gonna make a difference.
That's true.
So I guess I'm just wondering about the coordination with other cities, the state, or the region, things like that.
So one place to look would be the regional goals, so on this sheet. So we're part of that. I think that's part of what the state is working on now and why we have until 2029 to prepare this element, is they're trying to coordinate that, and they don't have that all squared away right today. So,
And I guess the other question I had, from 2014 to 2030, we are much closer to 2030 than we are to 2014 right now. Do we have a measure of progress and where we're at, or how close we are to achieving that within the next 5 years? Is that even realistic to say? I mean, if we've only closed the gap 10% and we've only got 5 years left, has anybody thought about that? Is that realistic, or would that help guide what we need to do, because we need to up our game if we're only?
yeah, I mean, we obviously have to measure our carbon.
Right.
And as far as I know, that hasn't been done recently, so.
And so I guess that's just something I was thinking about, when you're using these numbers, I mean, throw them around, but how, I imagine it's quite a task to measure. Do we have benchmarks? I mean, how are we gonna, I guess it would seem to me that it'd be helpful to know how close we are, since we're only 5 years away from that.
Yes, I don't have that information, and I know it is specific to Everett, and there are consultants. We hired a consultant team last time. I worked with them in 2013, 2014. So they have their model and they get their inputs. So we would just have to contract with them or somebody else to do that analysis. It's not something, even though I'm an environmental planner, I'm not going to be doing that personally, so.
So a couple notes of context on that. The Puget Sound Clean Air Agency and Puget Sound Regional Council have adopted a regional goal that the city needs to be consistent with, and that is roughly what we've got in here, 50% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. If that regional target is more aggressive than the city target, we may need to look at reconciliation there. If they're roughly consistent, my guess is that from 1990 to 2014, emissions increased substantially. So we may not be quite at the level that we need to be region-wide, but then again, that's a region-wide target, and individual jurisdictions' results may differ. There is a ton of work obviously going on around climate change at both the regional and the state levels that we're going to be nested within. House Bill 1181, the climate change bill that came out of the legislature a couple of years ago, included some, in addition to requiring local climate planning, it required the state to come up with a whole lot of resources, model elements, technical resources like inventories, and a methodology for tracking reduction actual. So it makes the most sense, I think, to wait for that to come. This was is going to be released over the coming year or two. Puget Sound Clean Air Agency and Puget Sound Regional Council have their own work programs around climate that implicates the city. There's a federal infrastructure investment acts, and some of that federal infrastructure dollars are connected to climate action plans at the regional level. So all of that and what Everett can do is a shadow of what we can do together as a region and as a state, and of course even beyond that.
One thing that maybe Yorick knows more about because of his work with the Clean Agency Authority, that's the state group. I actually found out about this by reading the Everett Herald a while ago. So the whole city of Everett is considered by the state as a overburdened community. And because of that, there's funding for overburdened communities to acquire more monitoring equipment. Because if you don't measure it, you don't know if you've met your goal. So my understanding, according to that newspaper article, was that there were two monitoring devices that were going to be installed in Everett. But where those are and how we hear about that, I really do not know. So just something specific, but yet I'm not sure where that information goes and how we hear about it. So if that helps.
And I guess my sense, I mentioned, I'll reiterate, to me, I still think if climate change and greenhouse gases is as an important issue as it's being portrayed, I think these goals are very, very modest and probably not aggressive enough.
You could consider with the goal adding words like at least achieve a reduction of, you could.
And I'm not necessarily saying they're not good, because I understand we also have to put in the context of the region and everything else too. And
Yeah.
it's a larger issue, and maybe I'm speaking on a larger level than, not to be critical here. Not just that maybe unfortunately the state of the world is difficult
True.
on this issue.
I guess the other thing, just for what it's worth, is we are allowed to update our comprehensive plan once a year through the docketing process. So if we find out from monitoring and the carbon wedge analysis that, yay, we met this goal, then you can bet staff will come up with the next thing that we can do. So there will always be something we can do better. Other questions? Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll sort of put this element there, and then as various other elements are being drafted, I will be making sure that the staff are referring to the policies we need to do the crosswalk with. So,
I guess, I don't know if we were moving on, but I was going to ask about the resilient communities section too. I don't know if you want to get there later or.
okay, ask away.
I guess just personally, my thought and observation is that dealing with mitigating, what to me is the most obvious issue of climate change is heat. Longer summers, drier summers. Two things that come to my mind are water supply and lack of rain and the snowpack, and energy needs potentially for running more air conditioning, that sort of thing. Is that something that's those two things being addressed anywhere? Or are they on the city's radar at some level?
Yes, certainly, the Everett water utility with Spada Lake, we sell water. So, and then as the snowpacks melt earlier, because of warmer summers, that is a little bit of a problem. So I'm sure we could have people from our utilities come and talk with you about that, but.
It will also be probably in our public facilities section. So it's coming to you later.
Which is its own separate element. And you'll hear about what we call functional plans. So the city is required to have a different comprehensive plan that deals with the water utility. So they have their 20-year plan.
And then in these policies, so you'll see on page 5, CCR 4.5, encourage landscape design and maintenance in agriculture that reduces water, pesticide, herbicide use, including transitioning turf lawn areas to native ground covers, shrubs, and trees. So that you were asking about water supply, and I think in general we feel comfortable with the water supply that we have, but we still need to do right by conservation in there. So that's the kind of policy. Does that hit the right note in terms of reducing our water supply? And then there's also our water use. And then there's also because the less that we use, the more we have to sell to other districts that may be challenged. And then we've got one about energy generation. There's a goal, increase renewable energy production and use, and support installation, that's goal 3, and policy 3.1, support installation of energy production systems, including solar, wind, and geothermal. And then a couple other policies below that that deal with energy production. So again, does that strike the right note in encouraging and supporting the kinds of regulations, incentives, and city actions that would expand renewable energy, which is going to be relatively small, what you can get on rooftops in Everett, but every bit counts. And then I think we've got some policies around energy conservation that I think are being sent to the design and development element. Use incentives to encourage increased energy efficiency and use of sustainable building methods and materials. So we try to touch on each one of those. Produce more power, use less power. Can't produce more rain, but we can use less water. And the heat island mitigation is in here somewhere
Yeah,
as well.
plant trees, increase our.
Yeah, and focus on areas that are short on trees. So all of those, if it seems like that's where we want input from the planning commission, the public and others, does it seem like we could be more aggressive? Is it unclear?
And I guess one additional thing is, so page 5 at the bottom are the 4 implementing actions that the city is talking about taking. So sort of looking at that, and in general, trying to reduce the amount of driving that we do as a community. The carbon wedge analysis really showed that that is the difference if we're not driving gas-powered cars. But, so you'll see that, that the city is planning on electrifying our fleet as much as possible, and coming up with an electrification action plan for all our city facilities. And we do have conservation measures for lighting and water use also. So, okay.
Question. This just shows my ignorance, but if everything is electrified, that electricity is being generated, I'm assuming primarily from hydro. I'm guessing, it's a question. But if it's not, where else is it coming from, and are those considered sustainable sources of power?
So,
Puget Sound Energy is doing a lot of different generation opportunities, including solar farms and wind farms, so that those are renewable, and they're looking at their entire list of renewables because they know that that's who their buyers are looking for. And yes, but there are still others that are going to be oil-based, unfortunately, or natural gas.
The state's Clean Energy Transformation Act requires utilities to distribute 100% carbon neutral electricity by 2030. And so carbon neutral by 2030 and 100% carbon free electricity by 2045. This will require thoughtful planning and implementation. So there are, and money, and that's where it's, the utility scale is probably the most efficient dollars per watts, but then you run into all, it's open space to solar, it's the impacts of hydro and all those sorts of things. So the more solar we can put on rooftops, the more geothermal we can reduce that consumption, then there's less of a need to produce the more power. But the state especially and the region are trying to hit this from every angle. There's in the wedge analysis, which I think we touched on in the last meeting, existing state and federal actions like that utilities one, like the no more gas engines sold by 2030, I think it is, in the state of Washington, the carbon market thing. All of those get us about halfway there. And those are some pretty dramatic actions. I mean, that's no more gas-powered vehicles in like 10 years will be sold. That gets us halfway to these targets. The other half needs to be new initiatives, and a lot of those are what are contemplated in these policies. It's things like even more efficient land use, even better transit access and use, even more walkability, even more local energy production.
And see, to me, some of those things are the low-hanging fruit. I think about the location of the park district project as opposed to being downtown. I don't know that that citing of that project is consistent with this element. I think about our downtown parking policies where I think the parking limit is 90 minutes. People need to move their cars and do. So that's just extra that doesn't need to be there if they were 2-hour parking limits. So it seems like there's a number of things that are inconsistent with what we're trying to achieve with this element. And I would encourage staff to think about what the low-hanging fruit is that's out there.
I guess another question I have is, at least locally here, the PUD would be our, I guess, primary and hopefully expert on this sort of thing. Has there been any consultation, or is there some sort of liaison communication, maybe someone from the PUD weighing in on some of these things and helping to refine and maybe identify appropriate goals that are doable, yet also maybe, a little bit pushing things and,
Yes.
technology-wise and things like that?
Yes, and so one of the elements that we haven't drafted yet, the public facilities and services, electrical production is going to be one of those topics. And we have had conversations, at least I've been in one of the meetings with SNOPUD, and I think there's been other meetings with other staff, so.
I do want to know, just a little bit in contrast to what Commissioner Finch said around the park district, at least ties into something else. Like, we need more park districts everywhere throughout the city. I mean, when I lived in Seoul, I had 4 childcare centers within walking distance of where I lived. Like, we just don't have enough human beings to generate the demand to have the density of amenities that we want and need in our community. Like, businesses got to stay open. People got to put kids in, like, restaurants have to put, patrons in seats. Businesses have to have a customer base. Childcare centers have to have enough kids. And so if we want walkable trips, if we want to move us away from driving, like, we have to have the density of people to facilitate the ecosystem to create the amenities needed. So I think that speaks to the need of more park districts, a larger city, a city beyond 500,000 people, where you have the density to create a community that has the amenities we need. Like, right now, I have to drive 20 minutes to get to a childcare center for Sam. And it just, I don't, but it's frustrating because I live within walking distance of my work. And so I can't have everything within walking distance because there's just not enough of us to support everything in walking distance. So I think when we think about our climate goals, we need to think about our land use goals and how our land use goals support that. And I think density, more increased population to facilitate that is absolutely critical. Remarks complete.
Any further comments or questions? All right, I think
Thank
that ends the climate change and resiliency element. Do we have any public comment?
No comments.
All right, let's move on to new business, Everett 2044, housing element. York?
Thank you. And for this one, I'm not sure if this is an introduction.
It is.
It is. Introducing Frank Hong. Frank is our Special Projects Manager for Housing, a good demonstration of how important the city takes housing, was creating this position a couple of years ago. Frank's been instrumental in building out our housing policy area, and so it was a natural fit that he support this comprehensive plan element as well. Take it away, Frank.
Again, good evening, commissioners. It's my pleasure to be here to meet all of you for the first time, and I know you've all had a long day, but hearing Commissioner Lark speaking of housing, I'm sure we're all going to be invigorated and excited about this conversation that we have this evening. We have a short presentation for you. And just as you mentioned earlier, recapping, housing has been an item of discussion before the commission on a variety of, on various meetings throughout 2023. From August 15th, the Alliance for Housing Affordability, Chris Collier was here to provide you some context of housing. The Planning Department also briefed you on the approach and the requirements of the housing element in August 15th and September 19th. So tonight's presentation, we're here to discuss more of the actual outputs that we've developed since then, the draft goals and policies. And just for your context, you can refer to your memo and the information that was provided in there. what's guiding our work this evening, the city's goals and policies, is a lot of other overarching goals, policies, strategies, and actions that you see in this screen. And I'm not going to go through each one of them, but I'm sure you've been told of some of these in the past. Of particular interest is our Washington Growth Management Act and Vision 2050. And you can refer to Exhibit 1 from your memo packet, which summarizes all of these overarching goals and has a little bit additional detail within. And as I mentioned, prime to this is Washington Growth Management Act, which stipulates that we need to plan for and accommodate housing. The other main piece here is Vision 2050 and the housing goal within. And so for our housing vision here at the City of Everett, as also shown in your Exhibit 1, Everett meets the housing needs for its growing and diverse community. And so this leads us into our draft housing goals. We have now 3 housing goals broken into 3 separate categories. And I know generally we should not read through these, but this is important, so I will. I'll read specifically on this context. Our housing types and opportunities go, encourage development of 38,558 diverse housing units to meet the needs of Everett's growing community while ensuring the city's housing stock remains in excellent condition with most existing homes preserved and well-maintained over the next 20 years. Our housing affordability go, housing is available to rent at prices affordable to the economic segments of Everett's population, including 2,900 emergency shelter beds, 3,700 permanent supportive housing apartments, and 19,700 housing units affordable to very low income households. Our housing equity goal, ensure equitable access to opportunity and housing choices throughout the city's neighborhoods so that all residents may choose their neighborhood. And the next slide shows what's really changed from the 2015 housing element to now. In the previous element, as York mentioned before, we had 1 goal and 13 sections with 13 objectives. Now we've condensed it to 3 goals to make it more easily readable and more pertinent to the challenges that we face now. Before there were 72 policies, and we've condensed it to 48 policies. 21 of those are new, and that's primarily because the previous housing element didn't really address housing equity didn't do the best job there. So now we have a housing equity section, and a lot of those policies are new. And as York already mentioned, what our goals and policies are, and as I just want to remind you, in your memo packet, Exhibit 1 and 2 are reference materials for the following slides. As we go into the policies, I hope you had a chance to review some of it this weekend. We're more than willing to address any of the policies that you feel you might want to discuss this evening, but we've identified a couple that staff internally have discussed at length, and we thought that might be of interest to you as well. But if there are other policies you would like to address, please mention those as well. So starting off, one of the policies that we were discussing internally is to promote housing development, is requiring all housing to include open and recreational space on site, except when accessible to parks. And this led to a lot of discussion in terms of what is accessible, what should be a park, what should be required. And I don't know how you folks, do you have any?
Yes, those questions. That was my thought reading that. How do you define a park? How far away? You know, how big does it have to be?
And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of variation as to what that means in terms of we can put a quarter mile, half mile, et cetera. I think, York, you mentioned that certain codes have, in our past, have already stipulated a certain radius, but if we want to extend that, shorten it, you know, well, the amenities, I think, are extremely beneficial when we're developing housing projects. At the same time, you know, it can also be a constraint asking more from developers, but we already have to do some of this already, right?
Yeah, this is a policy, I'm not sure to what extent we had in our existing comprehensive plan, but we do have it in our regulations. We require through the minimum lot size and lot coverage, effectively, there's a requirement for on-site open space for single-family and related development. Multifamily, everything that's in the multifamily and mixed-use zones requires 250 square feet per apartment or per housing unit, I think. And that can be open space like lawn and a picnic table. It can be active recreation space. It can be indoor community space or something. So we have these requirements, and it occurred to me that many of these types of things should be reflected in policy as well. So we drafted a policy that's roughly equivalent to our current practice, and then if that's not the way that the city wants to go, one of the first steps would be to get the policy right, and then the regulations would later flow from that. It doesn't have to be exact. A policy wouldn't be the right place to say exactly 2,500 feet from this list of parks, but it should be descriptive enough that when we go to write an ordinance or amend that section of code, that we have a general sense of what we're trying to do, and that that's a consistent sense over time, and that we know what we're trying to accomplish. And so this connects to the goal, whatever goal one is. I think right now we allow, if you'll remember back about 3 years, to the multifamily, park impact fee. Park impact fee in around 2021. That instituted an impact fee for parks associated with housing and commercial development. We revised the fee in lieu to put a realistic number to it and allow a fee in lieu of that park if you are within, I think it was a half mile of a existing or planned park. So that's how it gets applied in the real world. If the policy were to say something like this, I think that would be consistent with the regulations we have. If that doesn't seem like the right way that we want to go over the next 20 years, then this would be a way to start that path.
Was there any guidance in the, through the missing middle in the Department of Commerce, was there guidance on open space or park requirements in that?
I think so. We talked about that at, maybe it was the second middle housing meeting, where we talked about the blanket lot coverage. We currently have 35 or 40% lot coverage. We talked about maybe increasing the amount that could be covered by buildings. We talked about maybe trading it for something that was more functional, like not a percent, but better tree protections, critical area protections, or requiring an actual 10-foot by 10-foot yard. Those are we do, I think, require, there's something like a 10-foot by 10-foot requirement in the single-family zones. The middle housing guidance has, I would say, 50 or 60% lot coverage. I don't think there were any standards on what goes on in there.
I mean, I think I have my reservations saying requiring all housing to include open space. I think, that undermines what I think is extremely important, which is density, and it creates density, a value density, which we could then use to fund schools, to fund our like police, fire, all the amenities we need. But I think there's advantages to making sure that we are creating park space, green space, and I really like the idea. I really like what's being done in Barcelona around the Superias, which is converting street space into more park space and pedestrian space. Because when we think, at least when I think about how I utilize parks, like I don't run around in circles. Unlike my toddler, I do not run around in circles in the open grass, but I do run along paths. And so, a big lot carved out of my, a big Euclidean chunk carved out of an area to be a grassy space isn't going to be as create the amount of utility for me. Granted, I'm just saying this is my perspective, as a long linear park that connects me to, a long running path. And, having trained for 2 marathons, there's not a lot, like it's hard to find really long distance running routes here in the city of Everett. It takes a little bit of doing.
So are you saying you don't like a 10 by 10 rule because it's a square?
Kind of, but I think we should look at the form, function.
Flexibility?
More flexibility, yeah, and the form and intent of our parks. Do we want to use our green spaces to connect our neighborhoods? And also, I would also say maybe maybe making the park the superseding priority of what we want for our open space as opposed to lot by lot, because then it piecemeals it. It's not efficient. We don't get economies of scale or effective utilization there. We have a bunch of small little 10 by 10s that really are just like, this is that grassy spot that we have right here. Can't really have a barbecue in it, can't really use it for much. But if we merge space and communitize space, we'd probably get more utility out of it.
And I just want to mention that we had internal discussions in terms of open spaces, not necessarily just parks, but as you're familiar with high-density buildings, but maybe also capitalizing on the roof, where a lot of times it's not utilized in this manner. And so having that requirement may incentivize the developer, or if it's required, will incentivize the developer to develop.
You will be incentivized.
Are there
Yeah,
any-
well, I think, yeah, it's the requiring all housing and then to include open and recreation, but I mean, I'm kind of agreeing on that. I think you're setting up, you're hurting density, and you're creating kind of this middling effect, right? So you don't really have enough yard, but you've kind of wasted it that could be more efficient if it was put into a larger park. I mean, so I just, on that wording where it says all and it says open space, I guess, I think there should be some clearer options in there, where I could see this being abused later down and then trying to create like, okay, everything needs to have 2,000 or an X number of square feet, where it could be much more efficiently used in putting that towards a park or the funding for a park and creating density there.
So, so are you saying like, just don't have a requirement for outside space, or back up the specifics, not be so specific? Help me understand.
Yeah, I think so. I'm worried that like there's like a fourplex, or there's a situation where it's a demographic that doesn't necessarily need, a backyard to play in a pool or a kiddie, where they'd much rather go sit on a bench in a park, right? So we're not making because this says require all housing.
Sure.
So, and
Okay.
it doesn't just say recreation, it says open space. I mean, there's different definitions. I just want some flexibility in there. If there's situations where you're going in there and the idea is you're trying to emphasize density, that's not being, reduced or mitigated down for other issues.
How might we word something like that? That is the tricky part, because right now it is 250 square feet, and it doesn't matter what your preferences are or anything. Maybe I'm missing something and overgeneralizing, but in general, that's what it is. So what could be what would in normal conversation somebody say about the way that we would approach on-site?
Well, how do we merge in like streetscape, right? Like, we've talked about canopy coverage. Is that just separate? I mean, can we bring those two things together? Could that count towards open space? Because I
Like
agree.
in underserved areas,
Or just generally speaking, I
well,
mean,
the.
I don't think
except
anybody's
near
complaining
Park,
about having
it was
trees.
attempting to get at, if you're across the street from Clark Park, maybe a new fourplex there could be exempt from needing its own on-site. If you are a mile from the nearest park, then
Sure.
you do have to provide it. That's one option. The
What do
few-
other cities do?
I don't know.
Let's find our favorite cities and find out what they do.
And maybe it's an optional, if you're contributing to a park, I mean, the whole idea of a park fee is you're supporting a park, right? So then you wouldn't be required to provide specific open space. And I'm saying specific outside, a tree requirement or something like that, but if you're you start layering on these different requirements, it becomes very complex for you to review and complex for me to pay to have, submitted. But I mean, if you're contributing to a park and there's a park nearby, then it could be a fee, or you could provide, some kind of space for, if you're doing a standard housing, I guess.
Can I ask, is this separate from what would already be required with required setbacks?
Yes.
So you'd have to have your setbacks and then provide additional?
Yeah, and how that, often it is rooftop decks. So thinking of larger apartment buildings, it'll be rooftop decks, it'll be the gym, could be like a pool if it's a larger complex, it could be a little tot lot. Sometimes they're really good. Sometimes it's like the saddest little rusty, don't let your kids actually play on that kind of a thing. Would we be better off putting all those resources into a really high-quality public park that everybody can use, economy of scale? But maybe some people aren't quite close enough, or just everybody needs a space, and it doesn't have to be green, it doesn't have to be on the ground, it could be the roof of a duplex or a townhouse,
Or plazas mid-block in a development.
right? Plazas.
I guess I'm wondering, what is the purpose, what are we trying to accomplish here? Are we just, is this for the neighbors, to benefit the neighbors and the way it looks, aesthetics? Is this for health, because if people have whole space in their yard, they're gonna go out and do calisthenics? Or what, I mean, what are we trying to achieve through this?
Yes.
All of the above.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a dog, your dog's gonna need to go outside and go to the bathroom, and you're gonna use that green space because that's just what happens. If you have kids, your kids are gonna, they just do. It just happens, so.
And then I guess the consideration would be like Alex was saying, if that's the purpose, is that best achieved by saying each individual development or unit, piece of property has to have its own little space? Or again, maybe communitizing that and saying, each block needs to have an area wherever that might be. I guess the latter seems to make more sense to me.
Well, look at your word housing, because that's not houses, that's housing. So it can be a whole compilation of them in a development. So saying that the development needs to provide something, and it could be within a 5-minute walk, or, a 10-minute walk, or, oh, sorry. Sorry. But it's like, what we were debating was not necessarily the single detached dwelling. We were more discussing the multifamily attached, that there was space in close proximity, either on-site or in close proximity. So the question is, making sure that we get something as part of the development, whether it be a mid-block plaza, whether it would be a trail through the system so Alex could start figuring out a route, or whether it is a combination of money to the park, or mid-park plaza, or the trail through the system or something. There is no one-size-fits-all, but we were trying to make a policy that was a little bit more one-size-fits-all. And we knew we weren't succeeding because we kept arguing over it.
To
So
anchor,
hence, the camel is coming to you.
And I just also want to mention the wrinkle, because when you mentioned the community, and we focus on the word accessible, again, that, if there's a community that provided that, but then accessible, there's a person that lived near a TOD station, and would it be county accessible? They could just take a train over and use that, and that other community then would not have to provide parks. I mean, that's, again, a lot of the challenges here.
I just think one language piece to consider as we anchor this is that all housing must contribute to the open space and recreational space. I think the idea saying that everyone must pay into this, support this, it holds everyone accountable to doing it. But how we do it, we're still refining the exact language and how it. But we want to say all housing has to contribute to this. So I know we're talking about language. I don't know if that starts to anchor the conversation a little bit, but I think
I think that's a good start.
That may be the smartest thing you've ever said. I mean, that's,
the bar is pretty low. Look out.
I agree with that, Commissioner Lark. I think the contribution concept works well. It's difficult to do a one-size-fits-all policy, given the range of housing types we have and the various lot configurations. I would hate to forego density in certain areas where it wasn't critical to develop that open space on site. So I think the contribution concept is a good one.
Thank you.
There's a whole purpose statement around this in our code. 1909-050, you asked what is the purpose of this, and there's a purpose and intent. The required outdoor and common area standards for residential development ensure opportunities for outdoor relaxation, recreation, or community gathering places. The standards ensure that some of the land not covered by buildings is of adequate size, shape, and location to be usable for outdoor recreation or relaxation. These are an important aspect of addressing the livability of a residential property, and they allow for common area requirements to be met by indoor community facilities because they also provide opportunities for recreation and gathering. So helpful when those purpose statements are in there.
Yeah, as far as language, I'm kind of going off what Alex said, maybe some sort of language that talks about maybe somehow complementing or contributing to the connectivity of spaces. And for example, if there's, a neighboring space, how can you, I don't know, either connect to that or play off of that to add to, I guess maybe allowing some more flexibility in there because, yeah, that the addition of the contribution and being a part of the connectivity aspect, I think would be important.
I will say just, I think this is really important, and I think there's a part to play for developers in this, but I don't think we can go forward and not think that there is the public partnership, like responsibility by the city to do this. Like, one of my favorite parks in Seoul, because they've been working over the last decades to really change a lot of their urban space to make it create open space. It was a rail line that was converted into a very a 7-mile linear park that went from like Yongsan all the way to Hongdae, and it was just full of cherry blossoms, and on the side is restaurants, and it was pocket parks everywhere, and it was they had the municipality being intentional. And so with our policies, we need to have, intentionality and deliberate, leadership from the municipality helping, guide this process so that there is a vision that developers who are like, how can I contribute? Because I'm supposed to contribute. They have that pathway forward. So I think however we articulate it, we need to, also emphasize municipal initiative as well.
Well, and we have a park section, don't we? Yes. So we'll really push on that. My only tidbit on if there was something included about distance from a park, if our density increases and everybody is using the same distance from the same exact park, well, that doesn't really help because now you have a park with too many people. So there's no incentive to then somehow build something else. So that's my only caution.
Great. Any further comments on this policy? Otherwise, we have a few more to discuss, and I know many of you still don't want to sleep here overnight, so we'll move on. The next policy, HO 1.8, allow innovative housing types and construction methods and provide for demonstration projects that could serve as a model for new and more affordable housing choices. This is a modified version of an existing policy that we had in our previous housing element, 4.3.11. That still, that was essentially, again, considered permitting demonstration projects. This is a policy that other cities around the region have used. City of Everett recently had a program where they allowed for demonstration projects across all the residential zone sites, and they got 3 or 4 projects, a Habitat of Humanity site, DSC site, emergency shelter site, and a couple of other ones that without that program, they wouldn't have had those projects. So, we see this as a potential policy that can be leveraged to help encourage development here in Everett. Are there any comments or?
Sorry for my ignorance. Can you tell me what demonstration projects are? I don't understand what that means.
Something, it can be something that we have not seen here in the past. For example, like a modular or a mass timber building, or something really unique in the sense of like, I'm blanking on the name, the podments, micro units, these things that traditionally may not have spread throughout, but, I find that a lot, to Commissioner Lark's example, where I also have lived in Asia and all these other places, but a lot of times when we tell these stories, people just have this fuzzy image, but when we have demonstration sites, that things that people can see, I think it will help.
Like a template?
Correct, but
Okay.
it's really, again, looking at projects that we just have not seen, or where through this policy, we can enact a program or change ordinances, et cetera, that can help facilitate sort of unique projects to come in, and that can help set floor for others.
Very
One-
cool.
One example would be just down on Broadway, Hopeworks Station is a LEED Platinum, and it got a lot of incentives from the Department of Commerce to build in the way it did. And so it serves as a template. You can go and like, how did you guys do this? And they're like, this way, and it helps. Following up, like, the best way to incentivize things is to give out dollars or just give out resources. How do we do that without impinging on like the gift of public funds challenge for the city?
Well, sorry to interrupt you. Do you think that's already an issue that needs to be solved for?
Like, as in, I mean, my question is, how can we basically try to give out as many, right now, I would say the restrictions on gifting of public funds in Washington State really constrain a lot of economic opportunity, and also, innovate, like just allowing us, they halt demonstration projects. How far can we go? Maybe we should get the city attorney in here, but like, how far can we go into making sure that we can get resources out to people to do these things? Because at the end of the day, the best incentive is just resources in hand, or as reduce taxes as possible, because it kind of gets out of land use and into, fiscal policy for the city.
I would suggest holding on to that. We have a couple of actions that will touch on incentives. And, yeah, you raise a good point, and it is, what are our abilities to incentivize what we want to see? And I think that we'll touch on that a couple times here.
And I just also want to mention, while you're speaking in the financial sense, but there are other triggers, where, for example, deregulation, in the sense of looking at what we're doing now that's obstructing. So it's not all financial, but there are a myriad of tools that we have available to us to help coax development. Are there any other further comments, or?
I mean, I think the policy as written is fine. I'm not used to seeing the word innovative associated with affordable. That typically doesn't work in that direction. But I assume these are, example projects that are meant to inspire something at scale in the future. Do we not currently allow innovative housing types and construction methods?
So we do, but I guess it depends on, again, how we define innovation. And again, I think a lot of times when we think of innovation, we think of these sort of giant leaps. It has to be new. And I always remember in our business school, it's like, no, it doesn't necessarily have to be that big leap. It can be that small change, but it's a change that's not present in the community itself now. And so bringing in those new ideas can help shift that transition.
And they would still be subject to building code, right? From a safety perspective.
Correct.
So I don't take any issue with your proposed policy
And it's-
language.
This is only for affordable housing
No.
or new,
And more.
and then also affordable?
Because I guess it's sort of what do you get out of it? And for example, in the case of Burien, it was 100% affordable projects that they allowed, but they were willing to, again, exempt parking and all these things. So that's where, again, this policy comes
Yeah,
into
go for
play. It's how are we allowing these projects? What are we going to do as a city to help facilitate that? And so that's where.
Very cool.
But just one note, I mean, like, one of the challenges with mass timber is that we don't have much mass timber production here in the continental United States. There's actually a lot in, Canada and other places, so again, this is getting out a little bit out of land use, but like, what can we do to, cultivate the ecosystem that makes innovation or using innovative new materials more affordable and realistic? Because, it's more of a supply chain issue for that than whether or not they can build here or not.
And I'll just give one little example that Frank mentioned to me today. He's been doing a lot of work around modular multifamily and even trying to see if we can get some production in the city. And the height, because you need to fit the utilities above and below, the floor height is a little bit bigger. So maybe our 10-foot standard for floor height is an obstacle to that, and that could be something this policy would encourage us to fix.
And I know we're deviating, but to answer your question, yeah, I actually have been working a lot in the mass timber area as well, speaking with the folks at Darrington, speaking with the folks in Spokane and others, and trying to relocate some of those operators, manufacturers here into Everett to do that business. And so there are ongoing discussions in that area now that I can share when it comes into more realization or more solid efforts.
That's awesome. I love that.
Wonderful. Moving on to the next slide. Oops. The next slide references HO 1.9. This is more of boosting homeownership opportunities. This particular policy boosts homeownership opportunities through administrative, regulatory, and financial benefits. Sorry, can you remind me again, why did we hit on this one?
It stood out to me a little bit that we didn't have a goal around homeownership because we hear a lot about it from the planning commission and the council. So just wanted to put that we've got a policy on it, but not necessarily a goal. I think it's worth thinking about. We're planning for 39,000 housing units. The model in alternative 3, which is just kind of the best estimate of that we can get, assumes about 2,500 units of middle housing, which could be better candidates for ownership, but even then, not all of those will be. So then that leaves 36,000 units of apartments, basically. If we can't solve the big building condo liability issues, what is a reasonable expectation for homeownership in Everett? And is it reasonable to have a goal, or to accept that a lot of it is out of our control, like the condo liability, and that we have an ability to influence the middle housing and try to push that as much as possible towards diverse homeownership? What is it that we can even do? So just wanted to highlight that piece with 1.9.
If I may, I remember something that we were talking about ADUs that Commissioner Finch brought up, and this is something where he and I agree yeah, right, twice in one evening, yes, intensely on, which is accessibility to ownership. And so I understand the challenges on liability. I'm curious, opening of the conversation, if I may ask, where does that liability sit? Does it sit with the developer? So if you were organize all of the owners of a condo building and have them form an LLC and then have them be the developer, they would only be holding themselves liable for that, right? Like, I don't know.
I guess that's sort of a CLT model then, essentially we're creating
I think you can, the co-op we've talked about it a little bit
Yeah.
before, and I think there was an opinion expressed that it doesn't scale well. But I think we're seeing that we're not the only state that's kind of run into this issue. And back with the Urban Land Institute in New York this summer, I mean, I toured it's probably 400, 500, 600 unit co-op. I mean, it does scale. It scales well.
Yeah.
The state, this is not probably an Everett thing we could fix, but I mean, the state could help with some of those rules. And there are also, I think there's several multi-unit or 100-unit in Seattle as well that are co-op. So that would solve that. That is something we could encourage, and something that would actually give very affordable equity to our residents.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to explore. I think that relative to the legislative issues that keep coming up with liability, as I would say, I would encourage the city to align their position from a lobbying perspective with the outcome they desire. So if that's an important goal, charge the people that are talking to the folks in the legislature to advocate for the outcome we want. On this particular point, I don't know what is meant by financial benefits specifically. It's somewhat of an ambiguous term to me in this context.
Yeah, we were just sort of using it as a larger catchphrase in terms of what York mentioned in terms of our implementation actions later on in terms of how we fund projects. So that could be, again, a housing trust fund or something along those lines. What financial benefits does the city have that can help boost homeownership? Because, again, it's just extremely challenging since we don't have a lot of just empty, lands that you can just build single-family residential. So most of those products nowadays are going to be multifamily, and with condominiums being difficult to build, what other areas can we do to help?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, this is a good policy, and whether you're giving density bonuses for home ownership opportunities, other variations from the four corners of the zoning code and development standards. But I think in general, this is definitely a policy that we want to promote.
Wonderful.
Sorry. You said currently 2,500 home ownership opportunities.
That was the output of the development model that we ran on alternative 3. And it was 2,500 units of middle housing. So townhouses, duplexes, the medium-sized stuff, which that seems to be not caught up in the condo liability because it's
Right.
different type of construction, different scale and everything. Many of those could be rentals. Currently, they would have to be. So some of the other policies, the lot split, and then there's another one on land division into small fee simple, would be required. Basically, at a minimum, we would have to reduce our minimum lot size for land divisions to support fee simple home ownership associated with middle housing.
Okay.
If we do that, and if some number of those 2,500, then that's some number of home ownership. But then the rest are all big buildings that are gonna need condos, probably.
Well, I'd like to just encourage home ownership opportunities as much as possible.
I was going to say, everyone, mark it on your calendar, because it's 3 tonight. I agree with another thing that Commissioner Finch said, which is that we should have our lobbyists advocating for the position that we need, which is that. And then I just want to also lean into 1.11, just ask a clarifying question. As we talk about, the splitting lots, we're talking about literally boundary line adjustments. And I remember one of the first things when I came here, the challenge we had with development in downtown was that there were so many lots, and that lot aggregation and parcel aggregation to the size that was, conducive development was a challenge, because, once you get 3 out of the 5 lots you need, the 2 remaining folks are like, all right, I'm gonna hold out. But I also know that there is administratively, boundary line adjustments are absolutely headaches. They take years sometimes to go through, and because they're all unique. So I mean, where we think about it, maybe there's a better way than actually splitting up the land. Maybe there's a way that we could facilitate a kind of the co-op or the ownership of almost like stock in a land, as opposed to actual splitting of the land, to facilitate that and remove the administrative burden that can delay the development. So as opposed to thinking about just chopping up a piece of land, how do we more think about the value of the land and how to distribute the value? Because that's ultimately what we're doing.
And I believe, York, 1.11, that was in reference to ADUs, right, originally, so it's more the smaller lots or single family and then breaking those up for ADUs, is that?
Yeah, probably ADUs. It could be other middle housing, or even not even. There's an initiative that we're working on. I think there was some attempts at the state level. We're working on a proposal locally that would allow kind of like a micro short plat, where it's a small number of units, maybe even just split in 2. Right now, to do a short plat, you need to build out the site infrastructure before you record it, before you can start working on the development of the site. And that can be an obstacle to a property owner that may want to just sell their backyard and then let somebody else deal with the whole development. So we need to find a way to work within state subdivision law and the city's rules to allow for that to be split off the lot, require that the infrastructure come with the development, but not have to preload it, which makes such a barrier to entry that we're not seeing as many of those small subdivisions. So it's kind of a term of art. I think you'll hear more about it as the year progresses. It's something that we're just starting to look at. But yeah, it would facilitate homeownership at its root.
Any further comments on these policies? All right, the next one shall be slightly more controversial. HO 2.2, participate in regional mandatory inclusionary zoning efforts. And what essentially this is saying is that we're not participating in inclusionary zoning, because our existing policy, we do have that on the books where It was 4.3.2 to consider inclusionary housing, and through discussions at the city, why we aren't doing this right now is, it would put Everett at a competitive disadvantage if we, again, increase the burden of adding in affordable housing versus our neighboring jurisdictions are not. Then, of course, again, we're at a competitive disadvantage, but again, if we participate in a regional inclusionary zoning efforts, we would go along the lines of that, but how do you folks feel in terms of not doing inclusionary zoning then at the current?
Just so I understand, so you're saying work, like get a group, go, like all of Snohomish County, or get a group of counties to go in and to remove zoning?
Not remove zoning, but have that stipulation that all the jurisdictions need to provide affordable housing in as a proportion of the development that they're building. So that makes the scale equal across the board. And so someone won't just go across the border and say, they'll build right next to Everett instead of in Everett.
I think that's great. Yeah, make it a regional issue. It is a regional issue. Yeah.
It's tough. I have to bring up that with what I know about case law and takings law, it is difficult or impossible to impose a new mandatory inclusionary zoning regulation on property without trading it for some new development capacity. Seattle did the HALA, Housing Affordability and Livability A thing, where they did an upzone, but said as a condition of using this upzone, you have to set aside 10-20% of your units or pay a fee in lieu. Snohomish County is currently considering and may adopt mandatory inclusionary zoning along Evergreen Way as part of an upzone. My understanding is, so we're contemplating a pretty significant upzone. This may be the one opportunity to do mandatory inclusionary zoning, which says if you're going to build this building, you have to reserve and income qualify these some percent for some percent AMI.
So essentially,
We just don't think well, this was an outcome of last year's or 2 years ago's Housing Development Incentives Program and the market studies that went along with it. They said if you hang anything more on development, you're just not going to get the development. So we worry that the inclusionary zoning would be losing the housing and then losing even worse than not having it at all, because you wouldn't have the housing, which would put upward price pressure, and maybe that development would go across the line somewhere.
So to me, that feels like we better let the car dealership locate on North Broadway, otherwise they'll go somewhere else and we'll lose that tax revenue.
Kind of, yeah.
And it's this kind of sense of scarcity or fear. Is it possible to structure the increase in zoning to a certain level, and then once certain number of housing units have been developed, for it to go even higher automatically? Is that possible?
Yeah.
You could, at that point, institute it automatically or by election in advance thereof. That way, you're not foregoing an opportunity now to get it to be a regional issue, and you're not giving out all the density at once.
Right. Look at that.
It's number 4.
I mean, I feel like either one of us is gonna win the lottery or get struck by lightning on the way out, like, it's.
So we'll have to talk about how that might work. So we've got our alternative maps. There are some pretty dramatic increases in housing capacity, and Shoreline had pre-approved, saying that we're going to increase it sometime in the future. That is, and just kicking the political hit to a later decade is going to be difficult. What Shoreline did with their light rail is they recognized that they wanted to put the zoning in place now, but the light rail isn't there yet. So it was unlocked at certain years that would have taken an affirmative action to cancel that rather than, versus just letting it happen. We can do things like that where, who's gonna have to, which neighborhood, which area is gonna have to wait, or is it everybody is kind of like 50% and then 100%? I think it's a great idea, and we'll put some thought into different options for that.
I would say one thing about that I do like is structuring your policy conditions-based, maybe not timeline-based, but conditions-based situations that, hey, this is the amount of, affordable housing in this area, this is the density here. automatic upgrade. Now, this area has met its development goals. It now instantaneously bumps up to this. And so that we don't need to have these conversations every few years. It just goes. And I think, having those automatic, having those having legislation or policies about automatic course correction is a important thing to do.
I'll just mention, well, I think Commissioner Finch's idea in terms of hitting a threshold and then sort of having it above that, that's great too. That may work in some areas. I'm just sort of thinking in other areas where maybe the ROI on the rents don't justify, so then the developer won't build more and they'll just build less than or up to that point. Because previously I used to be with the City of LA, and when we had inclusionary housing in some of those places, and the district I worked at, some of those places had just did not justify those developments, and we had to scrape a lot of just inclusionary housing involvement, and we had to get involved to, unfortunately, just say no to that and push forth the project. So, that's where the negative side, if the market itself doesn't dictate and support it, then we see inclusionary housing as more of a barrier.
Well, at that point, can we add a rider that says, hey, this is up to the planning director as well, right? Like, you can have an exception. It could be a PDO that is unique to that particular situation if we don't see that impact that we'd like, right?
I think so.
Well, and to say that my idea was half-baked is an overstatement. So I'm sure there are a number of challenges with that concept. I would look at it on an aggregate basis, not on a development or block basis. But it was really in response to you're giving away the farm and then letting the cities around us develop. And we are stuck because developers don't see a market to include that level of affordability in projects and keep them viable. So I think we need to remain competitive, and maybe we can build in some safeguards to also achieve these goals on a regional basis.
And kind of piggybacking off an early statement, the municipal intentionality, like the city needs to empower the Everett Housing Authority to be a housing developer and build with its, zero profit initiative. And so whatever the city could do to support that and just have a part of its, municipal capabilities to just go forth and execute a mission, like that needs to be part of it, because we can't just delegate to developers to achieve goals. Like, I just don't think that's just not how we're gonna get there.
Great. Any further discussion on this item? All right. The next policy, 3.6, institute educational programs and protections for tenants on tenants' rights, evictions, protections, and assistance programs. This is one of the policies in our new housing equity section. Sorry, I can point to Kimbrough. What was our inclusion of this again? Why did we include 3.6? This was through an earlier discussion today when we were identifying certain policies in the housing equities, and we felt that these were strong policies that we should, that may be of interest to the commission this evening.
Yeah, so hi, Kimber Landry. I'm the Community Development Manager for the city. One of the requirements that the city has to do, because we receive funding from HUD, we receive CPD funding from HUD, Community Planning and Development Funding, is we have to submit what's called an affirmatively furthering fair housing report. That's an assessment of fair housing that we conduct. It also goes along with an equity plan under the current AFFH rule with that. One of the impediments that was identified as far back as 10 years ago is the fact that the City of Everett needs to step up education for tenants and other fair housing protection actions that can be done. Some things are identified in the current AI it is available online if anybody's really interested, are a couple other things regarding fair housing protections for tenants. Some things the city's appropriate to do, some things it might be more appropriate for community partners to do. So one of the things that we also try and do is help to fund any program that can help to augment some of these efforts to address impediments. But this one in particular, again, housing equity being a new element in new goal in your housing element itself, And then just kind of elevating this to be compliant with some of the federal standards that we have is one of the reasons I know that we ended up plucking this one out. But if Frank can think of anything else I may have missed, happy to discuss further. Okay.
Yeah, my only comment is, I think that education is great. I think that it is very difficult to evict tenants in this state. Having gone through multiple eviction processes in a very small rental property that I own personally, it's very challenging. And that time, if you have a mortgage, you're servicing the mortgage, you're paying all the expenses, and you're gonna have significant turnover costs. At some point, small-scale landlords don't want to be in that business anymore. There's no upside. So the harder we make it to evict tenants that should be evicted, the fewer opportunities you're going to see.
Could that education include education for the owners?
I mean, I think those resources are out there, but even if you follow the process perfectly, it is an expensive and time-consuming process and zero fun.
Is it because of state rules or because of city?
I don't think these are city rules.
Sure.
Housing affordability, stability, and enhanced community amenities where public and private investment has been insufficient. And again, this is under our housing element section to achieve our equitable access to opportunities for housing.
I don't know who wouldn't like this one.
Just out of curiosity, what are we defining as historically underserved areas?
I think traditionally,
I don't think we have it defined. I think we're building a glossary and we're gonna wanna have words like that defined. Vulnerable community is defined, overburdened community is defined, historically underserved community. If it is in the eye of the beholder, then we could probably put some definition around that.
I guess, actually, was this encouraging the city to invest or encouraging private developers to invest?
Yes.
I think it can be broad, both. A lot of our work right now is, I don't believe that the city can be the only entity to be involved here. The housing challenge is so great that we need to leverage public-private partnerships, joint ventures, et cetera, to address situations, especially again in areas that are historically underserved.
Yeah, I guess that was, I mean, I don't know how it could be, how anyone would necessarily object to that. I also don't know what, this doesn't really mean a whole lot. I mean, this by itself is nothing. You need specific policy. So it's really easy to say this is what I'm saying. Sure, this is great. This is, what it really means, that would be, I think, very difficult to identify what you would actually do to carry this out.
Yeah, I agree. I'm wondering, how do we make this stronger? Or what would be the next step to direct investment historically, or a word that would actually cause this to have some effect? Because I think as it's written, it's nice to say, but it doesn't really cause anything to happen.
I think, sorry, my apologies.
Especially the final few words, where public and private investment has been insufficient. Insufficient of what?
I think I circled that as well. So there's a multi-county planning policy that seems to hit roughly the same topic with slightly different wording. It's DP2, reduce disparities in access to opportunity for the region's residents through inclusive community planning and targeted public and private investments that meet the needs of current and future residents and businesses. I think that's the. Yeah, so, yeah, which will reflect in the urban form chapter. I think the general idea is to reduce disparities in access to opportunity. So I guess what kind of investment, this is the housing chapter, so it's focusing on housing, and we'll put a little bit more thought into this one to clarify.
I mean, I think at a federal level, not a direct corollary, but the opportunity zone legislation would be a federal example of what I think this policy is intending.
Mm-hmm.
So things like that we could do at a city level would be great.
I would also say, back to municipal initiative, put a guidance for the city to do a thing. Have them not just encourage it, have them also encourage it with, private developers, but they themselves will do it. We will build a 15-story building in the vicinity of the upcoming light rail on Casino Road that will be affordable. Like, just have something, the city needs, our policies can't just be delegating it out to encouragement. It has to be, there needs to be that partner action, and the city needs to find it, because there's ways to do that. I mean, you can, if you have a chance and you can pencil it, we can put a double barrel bond together, which is like revenues and tax, and you can build a building. Like, if we have that, they should be more compelled to, the city should be more compelled to do that.
I'll draw a connection from this to displacement as well. So there's the concern around economic displacement and gentrification that can come from the addition of, light rail has the potential to make an area more popular. We think that housing supply can overcome those economic headwinds to a lower income renter, and this would be along those lines. If we were to encourage housing development, and especially affordable housing development, we might use this policy to help guide that encouragement towards these areas that have not had as much housing development but need it. But again, we'll put some more thought into this.
Okay. Any further questions or comments? Now we'll move into our implementary actions.
And just, we highlighted these. I mean, you heard some of the conversation, some of the reasons we wanted to highlight these. Are there any others that you noticed in your reading? And then also, did we miss any topics? And we will be back in a couple of weeks if anything else comes to mind with some more thoughts. But this has been great feedback on these ones.
Just, I mean, we kind of covered it, or we kind of talked around it, but I mean, I think there should be a specific policy that, with a better word, that encourage the private-public partnerships in the community to build the housing. Just
Thank you for all of your feedback. So moving on to implementation actions, and these are actions that we are looking to do over the next 5 years. The first one relates to housing affordability, development, finance, and ownership, and it's implementing a comprehensive housing finance strategy that supports and facilitates anti-displacement efforts and the development of market rate and low-income affordable housing. Examples, as sort of mentioned earlier, Housing Trust Fund, the MFT program that we have currently in operation, housing levy or use of credit enhancements. And again, there are a lot of various tools here in terms of sort of that housing finance side that the city can participate in to help spur development. And if there are any questions on any of the specific things, for example, I don't know if folks are familiar with credit enhancements, but it's essentially leveraging the city's credit. The city has excellent credit, low debt capacity, and so we can, certain municipalities right now, for example, King County and King County Housing Authority, they lend their credit to another institution to use so that they can either secure a loan or secure a lower interest loan. We're looking at this program for possibly as extended not just to possibly EHA, but maybe like a private developer that can help move the market in this very challenging environment. So that, again, is just some of the concepts that we're currently in discussion. Are there any comments on this action item?
The anti-displacement efforts, that seems to be contrary to redevelopment efforts. And so are we talking about relocation assistance? Because I think what we're talking about is vulnerable populations that are living in dwelling units that are reasonably affordable. These are typically buildings that are also dilapidated and probably slated for, or highest and best use is redevelopment. So we've got a natural conflict there. We're not talking about leaving those people there. We're talking about facilitating them going somewhere else that's safe, that they can afford, correct?
Could be. One of the challenges, especially with the equity and the housing equity and displacement, there's just not a lot of resources in that space. There's a lot of resources to build new affordable housing, but again, we want to keep folks in the community. For example, if we're discussing Casino Road and with all the energy, the capital infrastructure through sound transit, we don't want folks to leave that community, but if there's housing funding that can contribute to a project that can create more units so that they have first rights to stay in the community, that can be a policy in terms of anti-displacement, not necessarily relocating them elsewhere and displacing their whole livelihood.
Understood. I think that's great. I think that that's a nuance that's not picked up in the language. I'm not sure how to capture that, but I think it's important to make sure that we're not trying to say two different things.
To piggyback off of that, there is that tension that's there. Like, we want more buildings here, but we do want the people who are there, the communities that are there, to basically have first right of refusal to leave there, because we don't want to disrupt what has been built there. You know, relocating and scattering populations and communities to the winds completely rips and destroys all the wealth and what has been built there, which is worth the keeping. And I think there's examples, like Fruitvale Station in Oakland is a really good example of, you know, how that was done. So we have templates to look to that allow us to do this. So, but I do think capturing the nuance in there is really important.
Just kind of to add in, sorry. To add in on the assistance for first-time home buyers, affordable, you know, I know it sort of says that in there, you kind of find it in there, but I think that's a very specific thing to get people into houses for the first time.
Yeah, and just bringing up right of first refusal, I mean, back when we did the housing action plan, or in the Rethink Housing, there was mention of numerous different strategies and action items for us to take to help prevent displacement. So are we incorporating elements of that Rethink Housing plan?
It was a guiding document for the policies and the actions especially, and there is a, what is it, 4.1, I was just looking at it, institute protections for tenants to reduce displacement, and there's some others. Our primary approach to addressing displacement is supply, I think. There's some preservation, so working with partners and with some of these new tools that Frank is working on, looking at for the city. It could be to purchase a building that's up for sale, but that would include rehabbing and making sure that it meets good safety and health standards. But in general, it's trying to, I guess, outrun gentrification with supply across the price spectrum and making sure we've talked about a goal of no net loss of affordable units within certain geographic areas. Maybe that's something that could wind its way into the plan. But as we grow, that there still remains, and basically it's encapsulated in the goal, ensure that all residents may choose their neighborhood, and that includes the neighborhood that they're currently in.
And Commissioner Adkins, all the functional plans that are in existence in the city will be referred to by reference in it. And all of their actions are still active actions. So we don't have to necessarily repeat them in this set, because otherwise the volume is just going to continue to grow and nobody's going to read it. And I keep saying in all of our staff meetings that we're holding the pen for the community, and this is the community's plan, and we want to make it as accessible as possible for the community to read and pick up and say, okay, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. So trying to keep that mantra in mind as we move forward. So just to answer that part of the question.
Great. Are there any further comments on the first action item? The next action item is similar, where a lot of municipalities right now are pursuing social housing because of the housing affordability challenges so immense that not just public housing authorities or large governments are doing, but again, regional, local governments are looking at how they can impact housing affordability. And the next item is developing a land banking program to acquire and manage surplus and acquired properties and to repurpose abandoned or foreclosed properties for affordable housing community needs. And, you know, this model right now is being used by the City of Atlanta. A lot of jurisdictions right now are raising millions of dollars for affordable housing, but the City of Atlanta did instead put in surplus properties and other things to help developers then develop affordable housing. So that's sort of akin to this action item here to pursue this for the City of Everett. Are there any questions here?
So a comment, not necessarily a question. This doesn't relate to any sort of time space, but I'm not sure that the city itself is the most efficient entity to manage these properties long-term. So there should be a focus on quickly putting these back out there in service. I think that not just affordable housing community needs, but also all housing, because at present, we don't have enough of any kind of housing based on the affordability tranches. It's not just affordable housing that we're lacking in the city. I would argue that we're lacking significant market rate housing. Everett's largest affordable housing developer is building 90% market rate housing in the Park District. So it's clear to me, based on that nonprofit housing developer's model, that they agree we need more housing in general. So I would probably broaden this and think about how to create mechanisms to quickly get these properties back out to market.
Great. Yeah, I'll just comment, when we're looking at this and generally how we deal with, or where the space that the city can get involved in the housing is generally within that up to 80% AMI, and in that case, that's why Everett Housing Authority is doing market rate, because that 80% in Everett is considered market rate. And so we sort of had this internal discussion of what that affordability is, and maybe in the wrong context here, it could have been, we should swap that out with like low income, because that then means housing up to 80% of AMI and fits in that standard of market rate as well, to hit on what you were saying there. But any further comments on this?
No, there's some connection to light rail station area planning. We're working with Sound Transit on the model code partnership, and there's a potential, I know in other cities and transit agency around the world, that we can capture some of the increase in value and use it for public benefit, including housing affordability. Now, how do you start that? Where do you get the funds from? I guess that's what Frank's got to figure out.
Are you talking tax incremental financing?
No, buy low.
Sell
in
high?
Anticipation. I guess it would be sell high. Yeah, buy low and develop with the benefit of having bought low, or buy low, develop part, sell the other part high to feed back into a revolving fund, those types of things. I've heard well, the first railroads in the United States were kind of on that model, and then Tokyo is sort of famous for that, where the rail companies get into real estate and they create the value, capture some of that value, and then some of it with the city or whoever the partner would be. The point being is that some of that increase in value that is the result of public investment then gets turned back into public benefit.
Yeah. And City of Seattle does a lot of that with their funds. They buy up a lot of just undervalued properties. And also in response to what you mentioned, Commissioner Fish, it wouldn't just be the city would be doing this. There are efforts currently in terms of possibly forming a PDA here, a Public Development Authority, to then manage some of these development activities. And so that's where some of the connections would go with the land banking. The next action item, this is the one that Karen mentioned earlier that was originally in the climate change resiliency element that got moved into here. It's essentially to further expand our use of the MFTE program. Currently, right now, it's just to incentivize market rate development to include affordable housing, but if we can expand that further and incentivize not just affordable, but also environmentally sustainable housing, whatever standards that may be, whether it's LEED, et cetera, we can define that later on. But again, to encourage sustainable housing. And, you know, is there any comments on this?
And I'll just add that with the Housing Development Incentives Program work that reviewed our feasibility and the financial characteristics of our housing supply and our housing market, and then expanded significantly our MFTE program, there were some findings in there, or some recommendations from the consulting team, that the 8-year be on sort of a time limit. The 8-year MFTE is just for building housing. Right now, we just need housing, so it's a good thing to give that incentive to build any sort of housing. When we've successfully catalyzed the market and it can stand on its own 2 feet, then maybe we start to ask for a little bit more for that incentive. Right now, we require 20% of the units be affordable for the 12-year affordable housing. I think that's in some other action plans and policies, but that is what this would connect to, that And that could be sustainability, it could be energy efficiency, it could be affordability, it could be lots of things, but to prepare for a near future where the housing market can stand on its own and we can ask for a little more out of that 8-year.
Great. No further comments. The next action item is related to the policy we mentioned previously in terms of encouraging demonstration and innovative housing projects across Everett. And so this again would be working to identify the land use regulations and amend where needed. Pretty clear cut. Wonderful. The next action item is related more towards housing affordability and equity. The action item, submit assessment of fair housing report to HUD and identify impediments regarding education and access to tenant rights and protection. And again, this sort of links back to the previous policy on education that, the education policy that Canberra reiterated or defined further. Any questions comments on this one? Then the last action I will be discussing this evening is coordinating and participating in education and anti-displacement efforts in the Casino Road neighborhood. And that, again, sort of links back to that policy we spoke with before. But it's pretty clear cut. If there's any other comments on this. No. Then that concludes our presentation this evening, unless there are other policies that, again, you've thought of, you would like to touch on, explore, or any other housing issues that we can address.
And we've got some great comments already, really appreciate that. That's exactly what we were hoping for. If anything else comes up over the next couple of weeks, we'll look into some of the things that we said we would. Is there any other data information that we can provide for the next meeting? Otherwise, we'll look into what we've already talked about and see what else we might come up with over the next month.
Charles, one more. Just a question. So if I'm looking at your numbers right, it appears that our housing stock is primarily 80% of it was built prior to 2000, which means it has really not what I would call a modern energy code. So if we're, as we can only build new houses, obviously that takes care of it, things, but how do we maybe go back in our housing plan to try to beef up the exact, or offer things that we can cause people to get their houses up to a higher level of energy conservation in the existing homes, keeping people in them and things like that. Just, I don't know if that would fit in this section. I feel like that would be something worth looking at, because I mean, that's 80% of our stock that's not going to change, that is clearly, or pretty clearly not going to meet, the energy code anywhere close to what we're producing now.
And I think, Alice, then is that more of a building code? Because again, we don't have any triggers unless somebody's coming in and doing a project and then going in and then uplifting, is that?
Yeah, see, and I was thinking of incentives or something where we're helping people, go out and whether it's, insulation or.
Well, maybe to a certain extent, because Canberra's group with their CHIP program, they help low affordable homeowners retrofit certain energy efficiency.
Exactly, but I just think that maybe has a higher priority in the thought that, I mean, literally 80% of our housing stock, doesn't have modern energy, efficiency. So.
I was just at my home, 1910. Side note, like I had to dig up part of my backyard. I found a horseshoe from the original stables that used to be back there. But it definitely does not meet the energy standards. It's not insulated for most of the house. I'm adding insulation to it. And like, I get where Commissioner Ballard is coming from, but honestly, the best energy efficient use of the property that I'm on would have been to tear my house down and put a better, denser unit there. Like, and we don't have that density there. Like my house needed to be, my property needed to be recycled. Like that's just kind of where it is. And right now I'm putting an immense amount of effort to bring it to insulate it. That's what I was doing last week. So, but I would much rather find a way to torn it down.
And just a note on some of the building energy and sustainability, if the policy applies to residential and commercial, you'll find it more likely in the urban form element, which we'll be picking up at the next meeting. We didn't want to have a policy on housing and then a separate policy that said the same thing for commercial. So we will, if we don't already have it somewhere here, we'll have something on supporting and encouraging retrofits, whether it be rebates or participation with Puget Sound or Snowpad, PSE also.
And just
I believe it's in one of the carryover ones in the climate policy one, and I think it's going into design and development.
Yeah, that's right.
Any further discussion or comments? All right, looks like we have another opportunity for public comment. Do we have any public comment?
No comments.
All right. Well, with that, someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any opposed to adjourning? All right, great, we're adjourned.